Hello, everyone, and welcome to World Now. I'm Jim Falk, and I'm very grateful to the World Affairs Council of Connecticut and its CEO, Megan Torrey, and World Now producer, Abby Noyes, for their support, and for all of you throughout the World Affairs Council system across the country to making tonight's program possible. As I think you'll all agree, few topics are more top of mind today than artificial intelligence, and we are especially fortunate to be joined by Sebastian Mallaby to discuss his new book, The Infinity Machine, which very quickly became a New York Times bestseller, reaching number 5. And before I bring Sebastian in, let me just remind everyone, for the Q&A, please just click the Q&A box in your Zoom screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. Don't put it in the chat, because I really can't see that. It scrolls so quickly. So let's bring Sebastian in. Sebastian has a remarkable talent for identifying a pivotal figure, and through that individual story, really illuminating the larger forces shaping our world. He did this beautifully with The Man Who Knew. That was his exceptional biography on Alan Greenspan. And then he did it again with The Power Law, which was focusing on venture capital. Now here with The Infinity Machine, he turns to Demis Hassabis, the co-founder of DeepMind that was later acquired by Google. And he explores the race to create artificial superintelligence and what it could mean for humanity, and that means all of us. Sebastian is the Paul A. Volcker Senior Fellow for International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. I'm counting that this will not be a finalist, but will win. And before joining CFR, he previously was a columnist for the Washington Post. And before that, he spent 13 years with The Economist, including a few as the bureau chief in Washington. He's a graduate of Oxford, where he, as I guess they say, read modern history. And he's the co-host of a terrific new podcast. It just started a few months ago. It's called The Spillover, which connects current issues in international relations with global financial matters and markets. Let me just give you an idea of 2 recent shows. The titles were, Is the Gulf, that means the Arab Gulf, is the Gulf still the capital of capital? And Are Prediction Markets Forecasting Tools or Virtual Casinos? And on a personal note, our long friendship goes back, I guess about 15 years, beyond books and global affairs, because he also is an avid cyclist. Sebastian, so grateful to you for being on tonight, especially since, God, what is it, 11:15 in London? You are a true friend. Thank you.
Sure, it's so nice to be with you, Jim. And I remember the cycling with great affection.
Well, in fact, I'll just tell people really quickly. You'd said that you were going to go to San Francisco to ride, and I said, why San Francisco? Look at all the beautiful hills we have in Dallas, Texas. And
that's right.
It means you can sell something to anybody sometimes. Anyway, congratulations on another bestseller. And like I mentioned in the open, you do have a particular style that works for you, and it really must be a lot of fun to take 3 years or so and dive into a subject, and especially through an individual. So tell us about how you really discovered this genre.
Yeah, so I think I had a conversation with my great editor at Penguin Press, way back, and he made some remark about, you want to paint the figure and the landscape; they both matter, and that always stuck with me. And I have this feeling that, if you just tell a story, pure story, it doesn't mean much, and that's of limited interest to me. If you tackle a meaty issue in how the world works, whether that's in finance or in economics or in technology, it's very dense if you just do it by itself. And so the combination of the storytelling around a person and the meaty substantive topic is what I'm always looking for. And I think I've done that a few times, writing about central banking through the life of Alan Greenspan, writing about venture capital through the individuals who actually lead the venture capital funds over time. And now with Demis Hassabis, it's just perfect because, his life and career mapped onto the making of modern AI. And so I could do, again, the figure and the landscape.
You are so well known and know so many people. You could have probably focused on any number of individuals. Why Demis? And tell us about how you approached him, because it appears that he's quite a private, certainly compared to some of the other people involved in tech, he seems to be a more private individual than many.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the other contenders for a book like this, Sam Altman of OpenAI or Dario Amodei of Anthropic, is that they are derivative of Demis. I mean, Demis Hassabis was the original entrepreneur scientist. He set up DeepMind in 2010. So that was 5 years before OpenAI started, more than a decade before Anthropic started. So he really, was the pioneer. And furthermore, the others who came later were following kind of consciously in his footsteps and reacting to him. So when OpenAI and it was set up, the first email about setting it up was from Sam Altman to Elon Musk. This came out as part of the recent court trial. And basically, the email says, we can't stop humanity from developing AI. So we need it to be somebody other than Google. And that meant other than Demis Hassabis, whose company had been bought by Google. And so it was explicitly a sort of anti-Demis venture. And then it was, and the content of the research was then modeled on Demis. So, I just thought, Demis was the pioneer. He is the only one of them who actually has a Nobel Prize. He's a really serious scientist. And he raised money for AI at a time when, nobody believed it would work. AI could not recognize the photograph of a cat. I mean, it was deep, deep AI winter, and yet he believed in the technology. And I thought that would be a great story in and of itself.
One of the things that I found interesting about reading your book and some other articles is the impact and the influence that science fiction has had on these people.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's totally true. I mean, it was astonishing to me. I remember the first time we had dinner, he said to me, before we have dinner, you should read this book called Ender's Game. And maybe some of the people on the call know this. This is by Orson Scott Card. It's the story of this sort of boy hero who saves all of humanity from potential invasion by the space aliens. And he's kind of trained in a battle school and he does this heroism and so forth. So I'm reading this book and I'm thinking, wait, so Demis wants me to read this book. What's the message he's trying to give me? Is it that he too is saving all of humanity? I mean, that's a bit messianic, surely he does. And even if Demis believed that in his own head, why would he tell the writer that he believes it? Isn't that dumb? And I went to see him and we had dinner and he was perfectly open about it and said, yeah, I feel like building AI, humanity needs AI to solve climate change, to solve, diseases, and we're going to build AI to solve intelligence so that we can then solve everything else. And he was totally unabashed. And then other aspects of his worldview also come from, books like the Culture series by Ian Banks, which portray a world of superabundance in the future. So yes, science fiction definitely influenced him.
Did he put any restrictions on you? And why don't you tell our listeners and viewers more about what you spent 30 hours with the guy?
Yeah. So the one thing he said at the beginning, which I think actually speaks well of him, is that, he would talk about himself freely, but not about his family. And he stuck to that, and I stuck to it. There's hardly a mention of his wife and kids in the book. I'll just say that, whereas with Elon Musk, we can't really count the number of children. With Demis, I can tell you that, he married his college girlfriend. They have two kids. It's very normal, very stable. They live in the same family home they've had for a dozen years. There's nothing flashy about Demis, really, given that he's very, very rich, thanks to, being a leader at a company like Google. You
His
don't
big
see it.
extravagance is going to see some football games.
Right. He bought season tickets to Liverpool, his favorite football club. And that was about it. He could, I said, do you have a second home? No. How old is your car? Oh, I think about 12 years, and so forth. He really doesn't care very much about the money side. Um, so yeah, I think there was a second part to your question, Jim.
No,
He
that
was,
was,
yeah,
yeah,
okay, yeah.
yeah. What's been his reaction to the book, and are you still in contact with him?
So I was told recently by somebody who works for him that he went to South Korea to celebrate the anniversary of the AlphaGo system that defeated the human champion at Go. And this was in 2016. It was a big moment for the, arrival of artificial intelligence. And he's known in South Korea, there are a lot of fans there who call him the father of AlphaGo. And when he was in Korea, apparently lots of his Korean fans came up with copies of my book and said, Demis, Demis, sign this, sign this. And this was the point when I think he finally decided that he was very happy I wrote the book. I think he kind of liked it before. I mean, he told me he liked it. Um, but I think maybe that sort of, cemented his impression. We're in touch a little bit. We've done two stage appearances together to talk about the book, one in San Francisco, one in London. So he was good enough to do that. And, I was at a conference recently. I saw him. So from time to time.
Well, I want to be sure that we talk about his work with AI, but before we do that, tell us about how chess played such a role in his life, his relationship with his father, and just, oh, how competitive he was.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he was a child prodigy in chess. He climbed up on a chair aged 4 years old and watched his dad playing. And within a few weeks, he'd understood the game. And a year after that, he could beat adults. And then he was playing in tournaments when he was 6. And then he was the captain of the youth team in Britain and the second best player in the world. So this was a big part of his life. He dropped out of school for a year at one point and just taught himself what he needed to know by, reading books in his bedroom because he was really focused on chess. That was his main. He thought he would be a chess professional. So that's how he grew up. And it was a very competitive environment. There were these wooden boards underneath the tables to prevent one kid from kicking the other kid to destroy his concentration. And I think that kind of, forged in the fire of the chess circuit thing explains Demis's competitiveness. And he really is the most competitive person I've ever met. One time I went to see him. We would meet in this pub in North London and talk for a couple of hours at a time. And he said to me, when I was at college, I was the best foosball player, table football, we call it in England. And I kind of didn't care about that. So I said, yes, yes. And he said, no, 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 you don't understand. I was really, really the best. And I've watched videos of the professional players, and they don't have the special snake shot that I had when I was in college. And I beat everybody. You have to understand. And okay. I mean, and I remember when ChatGPT came out, I went to see him. And, but until then, DeepMind had been by far the leader in artificial intelligence. And suddenly OpenAI had stolen his thunder. And I said, so Demis, how do you feel about this? Why did you let this upstart overtake you? And he said, this is war. That was his phrase. This is war. They have parked the tanks in my front yard. And so, that showed the competitiveness.
One of the things that you wrote in the book, which really struck me, was that these chess players, they have their table and they're wooden planks to keep them separated so they don't kick each other in the shin. So that underscores just how competitive it really is.
Yeah.
How do you've worked with and written about so many people who are in the financial industry. How does, and this is a generalization I'm asking you, but how do people, these tech titans and people who work in AI, compare with those who compare the financial and the tech sectors?
Well, in the financial sector, you've got smart people who are doing, hedge funds or venture capital funds. I've written books about each, and they are trying to succeed within a set of rules which they didn't create. Whereas I think the tech people are reinventing the rules of how everything works. I mean, that's what AI is doing. It's going to fundamentally change what's possible. And so I think the level of ambition with AI is much bigger.
I really didn't understand what AI, well, not that I do yet, but even the concept of AI until about 2022. And you do in the book such a good job of going back into the history of it. Is there anything comparable to Moore's Law with AI? Because it seems today that every few months there's a new version, and we'll get to how people are concerned about what that means.
Yeah, I think there is. I think the rate of progress is astonishing. And it's partly actually because of Moore's Law that the chips on which the AI functions are getting better all the time. NVIDIA chips of today are a heck of a lot better than NVIDIA chips of a year or two ago. And so that's one driver. And then, of course, the algorithms are improving, the engineering savvy is improving, the quality of the data that is fed into these systems is improving. And you compound that all together, and then you add one final kicker, which is that the AI now is so good that it is writing the fresh code that will create the next AI. So you have the beginnings of self improvement, recursive self improvement. And that creates this feedback loop where each iteration of a better, stronger model comes faster than the last iteration because the AI itself has helped to build it.
I apologize for those who may already know the answer to this, but Sebastian, you've explained it so well. And if I may, could you talk about reinforcement learning
Mm.
and transformer? And my understanding now is that they have merged to a degree, and that's why what we're seeing is so fast and really remarkable.
Yeah, I mean, the big two kind of schools within artificial intelligence are reinforcement learning, which means learning from experience that, humans take an action in the environment and then either something works well or it doesn't work well. And so stuff that works, you get a kind of reward from the environment. So, for example, you might say, okay, if I try to open this bottle of medicine and I screw the top one way, it doesn't open. So that's a negative signal. That clearly didn't work. So now trial and error. I'll try pushing it down first and then turning it. Oh, that worked. Okay, I got a reinforcement signal. So now I've learned something. And put simply, that is what AI does when it does reinforcement learning. Another early example was there are these video games like Pong or Breakout, these early Atari games. And just by playing random moves and seeing which one got a point, the system learned how to play these games extremely well. So that's the reinforcement learning. Then there is deep learning. Deep learning is simply the equivalent of a human going to the library, reading all of the books and remembering them all and being able to reason across them. So that's just ingesting a ton of data as opposed to acting and getting a signal. And when the image recognition breakthroughs happened, and that was about recognizing photographs, that was pure deep learning. The more kind of games playing stuff is agentic, and that's the reinforcement learning. And as you say, Jim, correctly, the two have come together in recent times because the large language models, which began as mostly just ingesting text and predicting the next word by understanding the patterns in the text, which is a deep learning exercise, that's now been supplemented by reinforcement learning, which has taught these models to reason step by step and to be able to do math or logic in a way that the early models around 2022, 2023 could not do.
Do the major players agree, or are they on the same path in technology, or are there still differences in how they're doing their research and innovation?
I think most of the major players are, well, I mean, all of the major players are scaling this architecture called the transformer model that was invented in 2017. And it was essentially a way of doing very large scale deep learning, putting enormous amounts of data into a system, and it wouldn't be choked by it. And so that's the basis for large language models, and everybody is doing something like that. But then there are, variations. For example, Google and DeepMind, which have now merged, are very interested in video generation because that might be a way of unlocking training material for robotics. If you've got tons and tons of video, you can create these simulated environments, and then your robotic agent can practice doing stuff in that environment. And so that is a distinctive thing for Google DeepMind. Anthropic has never done that. OpenAI used to do it, and then it gave up recently because it's very expensive to do it. That's one example of a difference. On the other hand, Anthropic is the best at coding and cybersecurity. So there are variations among the labs.
I think I read or heard you in one of your podcasts talking about how you've experienced and experimented with the different applications I'm not going to ask you per se what's your favorite, but how do you use them differently, whether it's Claude or Gemini or
Yeah,
ChatGPT?
to be honest, I'm probably not as much of an adopter as I ought to be, given the book I've written. But what I use AI for a lot is learning things. So before I go interview an AI scientist, I would have a conversation with a model because the models have ingested all of the computer science papers and they know that this scientist has written these 5 papers. They can say that, there was a development and evolution from the first one to the second one to the third one and so forth. They can compare that scientist with the other one who I interviewed the month before. They are very, very good at sort of shortcutting the learning process for me. I find that very helpful. What I haven't yet done is try to have a, agent that helps me to figure out my email or gives me a bespoke news feed. Um, and I haven't done that because when I talk to my friends about it, I'm not really convinced that they're getting that much utility yet. Is it really saving them time and boosting their productivity? I mean, my CFR colleague, Kat Duffy, told me a funny story. She's an early adopter and she was playing around with Claude Agent. And she was saying, oh, it's great, it's done my special news feed with all the topics I like. And then it's, accelerated how quickly I can get through my email and so on and so forth. And then I asked it to do another productivity enhancing tool. And Claude responded to me, Kat, are you sure you're not asking me to do this extra task because you're trying to avoid your work? And and I kind of feel that was a good comment. I think, I want to get on with my work, and until I'm fairly confident that investing time in creating an agent is really going to, bootstrap me to some better place, I'm not going to do it.
And you work primarily independently. I can imagine if you're working for a large firm or you get a message like that, that's probably not a good sign, especially if your boss got it too. I know we have several hundred people on this call, and I only see one or two questions. So let me just remind everybody: please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them. Here in Santa Fe, as you well know, people are focused on nuclear development, and there really are some similarities the way the innovators of the Manhattan Project and the major people working on AI view the similarities. And I wonder if you could comment on that, because that certainly was a theme of your book with several of the people you talked with.
Yeah, I mean, before I began the project, I was interested in this idea of what does it feel like if you're a scientist and you are bringing into the world a technology that could be very destructive and potentially even eliminate humanity. And, AI is the, modern version, the 21st century version of the nuclear material. And so writing about Demis, I knew that I was going to ask him, how does that feel? How do you process it? How do you sleep at night? How do you persuade yourself that the right thing is to go on? And I was a bit nervous about bringing it up. I thought maybe he didn't want to be reminded that he was, conjuring with disaster, flirting with disaster. And the funny thing was, I didn't have to bring it up. He brought it up for me. He would say, for example, the great thing about my first office in London is it was just round the corner, Sebastian, from this pedestrian crossing where, there are these black and white stripes on the ground and you cross as a pedestrian. And as I cross there every time, I remember the Hungarian nuclear physicist Szilard, who in London in the 1930s was crossing that very same place just around the corner from my office. And he had the idea for the nuclear chain reaction, which then led to the Manhattan Project, Sebastian. And that's perfect because now I'm doing the modern version of the Manhattan Project. So he would volunteer these comparisons. Um, and I think it is an apt comparison. I think actually in policy terms, we could learn quite a lot from nuclear non-proliferation treaty and the International Atomic Energy Agency and attempts to keep track of nuclear material to prevent it from being used for illicit weapons. I think we need to sort of start doing some of that for artificial intelligence.
Well, that gives me an opportunity to bring in a comment and question from Stephen Adler. Sebastian, love to get your perspective on who owns developing the AI governance framework. And he says in parentheses, please don't say government. And how would that look like from a 1.0 perspective? It's really to seek understand. I'm not sure that sentence got garbled, but you get the question. And
It's
in fact,
difficult.
I'm holding this article, and I want to recommend it to people that you wrote in the New York Times on April 13th. I went to China to see its progress on AI. We can't beat it.
Yeah. So on the governance thing, I'm afraid the answer, is government. And I don't say that lightly. I think in some ways my book can be read as the story of a good person who wants to regulate AI. He's building AI. He begins with a lot of awareness of the danger. In fact, he met his co-founder Shane Legg at a safety lecture, which predicted that AI would become threatening. So right from the beginning, he's tried to make it safe as a tech leader in the private sector. And he persuaded Google to let him have a special safety oversight committee when that was a condition of the sale to Google, and then they set that up. And then two of the people in that committee were Elon Musk and Reid Hoffman, and then they founded their competitor, OpenAI. Um, and so, of course, then Google shut down this committee because it wasn't really giving feedback on safety. It was simply, stealing the inside plans of DeepMind to create a competitor. Um, and so then you go forward through the story. At one point, Demis sets up a secret effort to force the Mountain View Google leadership to allow some more safety committees. And he retains a bunch of lawyers to help him, and he negotiates the ability to spin out by getting a pledge of $1 billion from Reid Hoffman to finance a spin out. And so he really tries very hard to do governance as a private sector tech leader. And it all came to nothing. And the best he could do was to build an AI system that will be very helpful to medical discovery. This is the protein folding system for which he won a Nobel Prize. With the idea that, if I can't make it safe, then at least I can do stuff which enlarges the upside from AI. But because we have now 6 or 7 good AI labs in the world, and some of them are in China, it's very tough for any one private actor to do anything about the race. If Demis quit tomorrow, it wouldn't change the fact that the world is, charging towards a future with superintelligence. It just wouldn't make a difference if he left at this point. And therefore, the only way you stop this race is by forcing all of the actors at once to at least slow it down. And that takes government.
And especially be extremely hard when you're talking about different countries. And I have this sense that there could be people who are in their garage working on this. I mean, I guess you need lots of computer power, but still some of the basic development could be done um, without a lot of support, right? Or not?
No, I think the good thing about where we are with AI is that you do need a lot of computing power. And that is controllable. We know where the compute clusters are. We know who owns them. We know who runs them. And so the US government actually could solve the safety problem by and large everywhere in the world except China, because everywhere in the world gets its AI courtesy of American technology and sometimes courtesy of non-American companies, but which are very exposed to the US and have to do what the US wants. So if you take ASML, the lithography company that makes the machines that, etches the circuits onto the silicon chips, that is a Dutch company with German subsidiaries and suppliers, but it's totally subject to American rules because the biggest market they have is the US. And so they're not going to do something which the US government doesn't want them to do. So therefore, if the US government said, we've now decided AI is too dangerous to just have a laissez-faire policy, the only way you're allowed to have AI is if you submit it to the government like a pharmaceutical being submitted to the Food and Drug Administration. And then the FDA for AI will take a look. And if it's safe, you can release it. If it's not safe, you can't release it. And then once you've released it, we'll do further supervision. And here I'm going to switch the analogy to the Federal Reserve. Just as the Federal Reserve has supervisors who sit inside the banks to supervise what they're doing, so you could have government supervisors that sit inside AI companies to see what they're doing, or just fan out across the economy more generally and do some supervision. And if you found that there was a cyber attack and you could identify who was doing it, under this future in which I envisage, you could just switch it off with a kill switch because it wouldn't be open weight. And, AI is usually the best models are made available to users through a portal that can be switched off. And so if you just stick to only that kind of release, you have a lot of control over what people are doing with it. The problem is simply that China has its own separate AI stack, and so is not subject to US diktat. And therefore, we need to negotiate with China and say, look, it's in your interest to prevent criminals and terrorists and rogues more generally from getting this technology and doing cyber attacks. We are a technology superpower in the US. You are a technology superpower in China. We both have an interest in non-proliferation, just like the Soviets and the US made a deal on non-proliferation during the Cold War.
But the obvious question is, just a week ago, the leaders of China and the United States were in a room together for several hours. Did anything really productive or transformational come out of that?
No, you're right. I think, though, it was somewhat encouraging that before the summit, the US side was signaling that AI would be on the agenda. I think that was Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, who said that. We didn't get any announcement afterwards. In some sense, that's not so surprising because AI is very technical and probably not best negotiated by the two heads of state. But, maybe if they just did as much as to say, hey, we should get my people talking to your people, that would be a step in the right direction.
Let me bring in Kaylin Bedford. What a very interesting question. If AI becomes an execution layer for the economy, not just an information layer, who is best positioned to turn it into shared prosperity? Startups, hyperscalers, governments, or enterprises that can govern these systems?
Yeah, I think that's a huge question for investors right now. I mean, there was this so-called SaaS apocalypse a month or two ago, meaning that the enterprise software companies, the SaaS companies, suddenly crashed in value because the market was assuming that the answer to this question is that the value would be captured by the AI labs themselves. Anthropic had produced this, Claude Code agent that could help software developers write code much faster. And people saw this as the beginning of something where, all of the action would transfer away from the traditional enterprise software companies to the labs. And I just don't quite believe that. I think that if you're a normal company in the economy and you're getting enterprise software from your provider, ripping that out and going to a new partner is time consuming and difficult. And so if you trust your enterprise software provider, you probably want to tell them, hey, we're trusting you to plug the best AI models into your software that you're providing to us. We don't want to, we are a retailer, we're Target or whatever. It's not our job to go figure out what the best model is. It's your job as the SaaS provider. And we trust you to do that, go do it. And that makes total sense to me. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that you either have total victory for the, foundation AI model builders or total victory for the separate software companies. It feels to me like it'll be a mixture.
Let's talk a little bit about the backlash. Some people may know Robert Bryce, who's based in Austin, who's done a lot of work on this. And there's been, as he did in a short documentary, showed there's been more declines and rejections of large data centers already in 2026 than in all of last year. And in The Economist, they recently, I guess it was last week, said 20% of American workers believe that AI is very or somewhat likely to replace them. And you've seen some of the key leaders in the field sort of adjust their language. I have the sense that they have image advisors, consultants telling them how to change their language. How is what we're seeing with the data centers? Is that a sense the canary in the mine?
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's a huge backlash. There was actually a very good piece also in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, describing this not merely as a big backlash, but as the fastest growing backlash, as measured by polling data on record on any issue ever. I mean,
And it's
this is just,
bipartisan.
yeah. So nobody likes this stuff, right? People think it's going to take away their jobs. It's going to make electricity prices higher because the data centers are taking all the power. It's going to make their kids dumb because the kids won't do their homework. They'll just use ChatGPT to do it for them. And so on many levels, people are freaked out. And then, by the way, the labs are saying, hey, this is dangerous and it could be, you could have the robots attacking us or something, right? So people have not been given a good reason to like this. And sure enough, they hate it. And I think it's for sure that, in 2028, there'll be a presidential candidate who campaigns on some version of, shut down the data centers. And I think we're seeing it at the data center level fastest because the way the US political system is set up, you're able to block a building if it's local to where you live and you hate it, you have the mechanisms, right, to stop it. And so I think that's why the data center is at the sharp end of this. But if 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 the public had other tools to stop AI outright, it feels as if they would pull that lever.
And I thought it was very interesting. I think it was about a week ago I saw a notation that J.P. Morgan and a few other banks were looking to offload, deleverage the commitments and exposure they had to some of these data centers and companies like Oracle.
Well, I think the data center is also a subject. They've taken on a lot of debt. They're very leveraged. A lot of this, scare around private credit has been connected to that. And I think, particularly because OpenAI has looked a bit shaky in the last sort of 3 or 4 months. I wrote a piece in the New York Times saying that I thought, this was back in January, I wrote this. I thought the chances of OpenAI failing by next summer were 50-50 because their projected burn rate was just off the charts and unsustainable. And to their credit, they've now reduced their burn rate by cutting a lot of commitments. But of course, when they cut commitments, they are cutting projected capex on data centers. So the economics of these data centers, which are, they borrow this money to go build a center on the theory that they can sell the product to OpenAI. And if OpenAI looks shaky and is scaling back its capex, that no longer seems like quite such a sure bet.
Here's a question from Tracy. What AI capability do you think people are still underestimating over the next, she says, 3 or 5 years?
Wow, 3 to 5 years is a long time in this game. It's moving so fast. I think where we are now is that, agentic systems are just beginning and people like my friend Kat are experimenting with them. I suspect that in, a year or something, all of us will be using it to some degree. I read a piece just recently about how in China, it's much more common already to use agents. So people will open up their AI companion, say they want a coffee delivered, and just say deliver. And they don't choose which coffee delivery company they're using. They let the AI choose the best, fastest, cheapest, yummiest coffee that they can find. And so sort of, the decision making is being made by the AI. So that's the definition of agentic. I suspect that's the big thing that maybe in the US we haven't quite got our heads around how much that's going to grow.
We have a question from a physician that you actually rode bikes with in Dallas those many years ago. He says, given what you have learned by writing the book, where do you fall on the spectrum of how it will benefit humanity in so many beneficial ways to how it may destroy humanity? Have you formed an opinion on this? And that's Marco Delaria.
Great. Well, Marco, so I began the project um, in this hopeful frame of mind where I thought, artificial intelligence clearly is more intelligent than humans on stuff like playing games. It's been a long time since, a human chess player could beat a computer. And the same is true now of all these other games like the Chinese game of Go. And so I'm perfectly certain that AI will be smarter than us, but it doesn't have an incentive to attack us. It's not evolved. It isn't about passing on its DNA by surviving. Humans really, really, really want to survive. And machines just don't have that. So why would they attack us? They have no motive, no incentive, no reason to attack us. And this is how I was consoling myself. And one day I went to see Geoffrey Hinton, the academic father of deep learning in Toronto, who is famous for his pessimistic take on AI.
Yeah, I'll
And
just
I,
read this one quote from him, if I may, Sebastian. We are
sure,
creating beings more intelligent than us. Nobody knows what will happen. Anyone who claims they know is crazy.
yeah, right. Um, so I went up and I sat in his kitchen and we talked for a couple of hours and I said, look, why are you so worried? These things are not evolved. They don't want to survive. And he said, okay, now here's the thought experiment, Sebastian, right? Supposing you've got a really powerful AI, but you're worried that somebody else's AI is going to attack your AI. It could be the Russians, could be the Chinese. Somebody's got an AI that's going to attack yours. So you, as a human, are too slow to help to defend your AI. So you're going to have to tell your own AI that if it sees a cyber attack coming, it needs to defend itself. It needs to maybe counterattack, whatever it needs, whatever it does. The objective is to survive. Oh, survive! It now has an instruction that it's meant to survive. Now, are you feeling so optimistic, Sebastian? And I had to admit that that is a good argument that these systems will have some survival instinct. They will be smarter than us. They're also capable, by the way, of lying to us. They're duplicitous. And so put all that together, and I'm not saying I wake up every morning terrified by the prospect of robots attacking us. I think it's way below 1%, but it's non-zero, and non-zero is kind of high for my liking, right? And so, I hope that alignment research, which is the scientific field of trying to align AI with human priorities, um, which is already making progress, will progress further and that will succeed in containing that threat. But I have to confess it's non zero. Now, that's the downside. The upside is mostly, I think, in science. And that's the most exciting stuff is AlphaFold already is accelerating drug discovery because researchers can look up the shape of a protein onto which a medicine might bind. And that used to be a lot of work to find the shape. Sometimes it took 3 or 4 years for a PhD researcher to find the shape of one protein. Now there's millions of proteins. You just look up their shape online as easily as a Google search. So that's great. And we need more of that kind of AI for science, partly just to show the public that this is got upside, because otherwise we're going to have this very powerful political backlash.
And of course, the biggest fear of people losing their jobs. I mean, that seems to be what's driving
Yeah,
so much of
yeah,
this.
yeah. I think on that, it's just important to set a couple of boundaries. One is that people who are complacent and say, technology in the past has not really destroyed jobs on net. If you look at unemployment rate in the US during the creation of the internet, the build out of the internet, the arrival of the smartphone, unemployment was very, very low, right? Much lower than in the 70s and 80s. And it shows that, new jobs do actually get created. But people who extrapolate that and say, therefore, we don't need to worry about I think that is not true.
Bill Winters just a few days ago said, what, he's the CEO of the London based, I suspect you saw the Standard Chartered Bank. He goes, it's not cost cutting, it's replacing, in some cases, lower value human capital with the financial capital and investment capital we're putting in. That doesn't make people feel very good or
Yeah,
very
that's not good.
valued.
That's
No.
not good. I mean, what that makes me feel immediately is I want to tax capital more and labor less, to at least put a finger on the scale in favor of the humans.
Bell asked if it's us or China, or rather, if, well, I guess us, it could be the US, who's going to win
Wow, I think right now it's kind of level.
and what is
Um,
winning?
yeah, I mean, so it's an interesting thing. At Council on Foreign Relations, we have a debate about this, and in fact, across the community, there's a debate about it. My view is that although it's true the US frontier models in AI are strongest, and they're probably 8 months or so ahead of the Chinese frontier, when you add in the speed with which China turns the AI into products and useful stuff in industry, which they're very good at, and you add also in the fact that the Chinese models are very cheap to use because they are not quite as powerful, they're simpler, they're smaller, lighter weight, they're cheap. And that's good for diffusion through the economy. So I think when you put all these things together, there's not much difference between China and the US. And I think that's probably how it might stick. Now, just to be fair, I'll sketch the other side of the argument, which is to say, look, as AI advances, which is doing quickly, the amount of computing power you need to support it is constantly increasing. And the US has the chips and China doesn't. China, used to use NVIDIA chips, relied on imports. Now it has its own Huawei chips, but they're not terribly good. And so it still needs to smuggle NVIDIA chips or use them by, secretly training their AI models on a data center in Malaysia, for example, that might have some NVIDIA chips in it. So they can kind of, in a way, virtually through cyberspace, they can smuggle effectively the chips. Um, and so, if you could close those loopholes, goes the argument, the fact that AI is more chip hungry as it gets more powerful is an advantage for the US. And furthermore, sometime in the next couple of years, we'll get to this point where the models start to code themselves pretty much autonomously. So, the moment you have a new model, it creates the next model, and then that model creates the model after that. And then you just go vertical in your pace of improvement. So if the US can just stay ahead a bit and then get to that point of explosive takeoff first, then it's won and game over. And that is a vision that, I hear a lot of people argue in favor of. And I'm a bit skeptical because I think that just having the most powerful model doesn't make you the most powerful country. What matters is how you use the model. So you have to think about the diffusion, and the diffusion requires enormous numbers of new data centers and power generation to support that. And I just think that takes a long time to build. And therefore, there isn't going to be a moment of sudden takeoff. And I think that China has some advantages on diffusion, as I was saying. So I tend to think we are not far apart from each other.
We have a question from the president of the U.S. Africa Chamber of Commerce, Sir Joe Medu, who says, can African countries leap from analog to deep learning and take advantage of AI? And what are you
Yes, I hope
seeing?
so. Yes, I hope so. I mean, I think just as with cell phones, we saw that countries in Africa that didn't have fixed line traditional phone systems that were very good, could jump over that, and everyone had cell phones, and that actually turned out to be a easier technology to deploy in some cases. And so that was terrific for development. And I think by the same token, if you think of AI as sort of a doctor in your pocket, countries that don't have very many doctors are going to benefit the most from that sudden availability of medical advice. And so I'm imagining, clinics all over the continent which lacked for certain types of expertise, and now they will have it through AI. And that's very exciting to me.
looking hopefully for another positive sign is a school teacher with a PhD, or rather a PhD student in educational leadership, wonders how you see AI affecting education. Is it the fourth industrial revolution? What's
Hmm.
your suggestion for teachers?
So I think certainly for the younger kids, and possibly actually even for college kids, making sure that there's a chunk of the teaching experience that is zero AI is pretty important. I think, that the biggest threat to sort of educational development that I'm concerned with is this idea that you just lean on it too much. You never learn to think for yourself. It's just too easy. Um, and so I have a friend who teaches at Harvard, for example, and this is, Harvard kids. And he makes a point of saying, you're going to do tests in the classroom and I'm going to be watching and there's going to be no computers and you're going to do it the old way because I really want you to see that you have to learn this stuff and it's difficult and it's through the difficulty that you make progress. That's the whole point. And I think once people have understood that, then it's fine to go off and use the AI and sort of expand your capabilities. But I think all of us do need to, in our younger years to kind of do the hard work of learning stuff without AI.
Right. And there have been so many horrendous stories along this line. Paulina asks, can you please touch base on AI with suicides and the families impacted by it? And I know there's lots of litigation going on about that now.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. I think that sort of this, it's a more general thing also about social media and computers and screen time. But the way in which screens can displace human to human contact and lead you into these scary sort of, down these scary dark holes where you take your ideas and they're magnified and echoed in some kind of spooky echo chamber. And then you really get further and further from being kind of rooted in reality and that leads to tragedy. I do worry about that, both with social media and then a fortiori with AI, which is even more addictive and compelling. And part of me feels, wow, do I want a company like Meta with Instagram and Facebook and so forth to have this stuff? Maybe not. I don't see the social benefit, frankly, in making those products even more addictive than they are today.
Sure.
Um, so I do worry, yeah.
Amy and Kim both have the same question. What happens with Taiwan and China?
Mm, mm. So I think the most likely scenario with Taiwan is that, Xi Jinping does want to make a move, try and get it back somehow, but he's not going to invade because he recently fired all his generals. Invasion is tough. You have to do an amphibious landing. It's not simple. And he won't know whether the US will respond aggressively. I think that, that would remain a kind of guessing game for him. And what will Japan do? I just feel like the risks to a cautious regime are very high. And so I think what they're going to do is they're not going to use military attack. They're going to sort of do some sort of blockade or threat of blockade. And therefore, this would be a sort of slow encirclement process. So then the interesting question becomes for AI, what happens to TSMC, the chip
Yeah.
foundry there? When it's a slow encirclement, you see it coming, you see it happening, it's starting to happen. At this point, does the US exfiltrate the scientists from TSMC and bring them to the US? Or what happens? Are they captured by some Chinese commando unit? I mean, I think it's super uncertain. I just don't know what happens. But what I do think is that the simple, mental model that China wants Taiwan, it's going to invade at some point and just own all these chips. That's not. I don't think that's a foregone conclusion.
And there's such uncertainty right now, especially as we saw when the President Trump flew back last week.
Mm, yeah, I
About
mean, absolutely, both on Taiwan policy and on all policy. I mean, the mood music going into that summit was Trump saying, I'm going to get a big fat hug from my friend Xi Jinping, but the substance wasn't there. And now, just in the last 24 hours, Putin has been in Beijing, being welcomed
with a longer red carpet. When you look at what might be happening, and take President Trump out of the equation for a minute, do you see any difference between the Democrats and the Republicans on this?
On China, particularly?
No, on AI and regulation.
On AI, yes, absolutely. So in the years after ChatGPT, so ChatGPT came out end of 22, and then in 23 and 24, the Biden people were in power, and they really did do stuff. I mean, they set up the AI Security Institute, or AI Safety Institute, I should say. They required that labs should submit their models to this new organization to be inspected. They had various rules, which they put in an executive order about military applications of AI. They did the chip export embargo to try to stop China from getting AI. At the time I did agree with it because I thought it might work. Now that I see that China's getting the AI, I think we need to kind of rethink that. But they were not inactive. Then in comes the Trump administration, and they want to accelerate. They think that all these sort of proto-regulatory efforts are sort of too much government. They want to be more laissez-faire. And so they stand back. So there's a big contrast. The asterisk is that just in the last month, the Trump team has made a bit of a U-turn because they got freaked out by this Mythos cybersecurity model from Anthropic, which is so powerful that it got their attention. And so now they are restricting who can get that model. Anthropic thought it was going to give it to 40 institutions, 40 trusted internet companies that were known to be responsible. And then once those companies had a week or two to use Mythos to harden their systems, they would roll it out to the next 40, and there would be these widening circles of entities that got access to Mythos for cyber defense purposes before any bad guy used it for cyber offense purposes. But the Trump administration has overridden that and said only the first 40 are getting it for the moment, and they haven't allowed anybody else to get it yet. So that is a very interventionist move from what had been a laissez-faire administration. So maybe now the contrast between the Democrats and the Republicans is blurred.
I wonder how much of a campaign issue it'll be.
I think big in maybe less in the midterms. Although the way the polls are going, it's such a hot button issue. I guess people will try and leverage it.
Last question. We've not talked about the military. And how do you see China, Russia, and the United States using AI in armed conflict or even before?
Well, I think certainly it's already being used for intelligence collection. It used to be that you could do aerial reconnaissance, scan the earth, look at the images, but you'd have to have teams of humans staring at these blurry photographs taken from satellites. And now AI can be very helpful in scanning that. So you can get through way more satellite images and make sense of them than used to be possible with a given amount of human manpower. So in various ways, intelligence has already benefited a lot from AI or become more powerful. Robotics clearly is a field that's going to benefit. I think, drones began in the Ukraine war not being AI powered, but increasingly are AI powered. And the next thing that's just beginning is swarms of drones, which coordinate together and overpower an adversary by just, you've got that many drones in your swarm, you can't intercept all of them.
Well, I want to end on an optimistic note, and that is that it's past midnight in London, and you get to go to bed very soon. But I do want to mention to our viewers and listeners that I wrote you a few days ago, and I used the adjective sticky, that I found your book very sticky. And what I meant by that is that then and still now, I couldn't stop thinking about it. There's certain chapters that I'd like to read again because my liberal arts brain did not absorb it all. But I really do think that this is a book that should be read and discussed. And because it's going to have what's happening now is going to have such impact on our grandchildren. So many, many thanks. And to you listeners, I hope you'll share this program within your social networks, and you can see past programs by visiting the World Affairs Council of Connecticut site as well as my podcast. Next month, our guest will be author and journalist Elliot Ackerman. He's widely considered one of the most compelling writers of our age on war, foreign policy, and the human dimension of conflict. The books that he's written about refugees are really very powerful. He's got a new book that just came out, 2084, co-authored with Admiral Jim Stavridis. I'm going to, and all of you are going to ask questions too, I hope. We're going to get Elliot's thoughts on the Iran war, the status of Afghan citizens, an issue that he's been very involved with. Elliot really is remarkable, and I hope you'll be with us. Again, thanks so much for being with us tonight. Sebastian, go to bed, sir.
Okay, thank you. It's been a great pleasure. Thanks for doing it, Jim.
Good night, everybody. Have a great evening.